Gray and thick clouds rolled in over the northeastern English industrial city of Newcastle upon Tyne on the morning of July 28, 1914. Coal, smoke, damp iron, and the briny North Sea were all pervasive scents in the air. There was the deafening thud of hundreds of hammers striking steel at Armstrong Whitworth shipyards along the Tyne River. The finest weapons of the 20th century were forged here at the Forge of Empires. There was an ear-piercing din. British maritime supremacy was heralded by a symphony of industrial might. With each rivet pushed and steel plate welded, a statement of dominance was made. Every single worker, engineer, and passerby on this particular Tuesday, however, had their eyes set on one enormous shadow that dominated the horizon. In the fitting-out basin, a leviathan lay in the black water. Just calling it a ship didn't seem right for the Sultan Osman, a battleship. A cathedral of war, it was a steel fortification that floated on the water. It was longer than 2 football fields when lay end to end, measuring approximately 700 feet from bow to stern. Its paint job resembled that of a contemporary dreadnought, which is meant to blend in with its surroundings during combat. The enormous hull of the ship was able to remove more than 27,000 tons of water. There were observation decks and fire control directors atop its steel mountaintop superstructure. However, its teeth were the most horrifying part. Its deck was adorned with 7 enormous gun turrets that housed 14 12-inch guns. Such a large number of powerful cannons has never been carried by a battleship before. A single salvo of its roughly 7-ton high-explosive rounds could melt a whole city block or cripple any enemy ship at sea, according to its designers. As a weapon with the capability to tip the scales of power in a whole area, the ship exemplified the zenith of naval construction. 500 men, drastically different from the white-collar workers of Newcastle, stood on the dockside in the shadow of this steel mountain. Black tassels adorned their crimson fezzes. The Mediterranean sun had turned their faces bronze. Turkish and Arabic melodies adorned their speech, chosen offspring of an empire that extended from the Arabian Peninsula to the Balkans. These sailors were the cream of the Ottoman Navy's crop. They had gone 3,000 miles only to get their hands on the ship. They had spent months aboard a nearby moored cargo vessel, waiting for this very moment. They were still in a good mood despite the unpleasant and confined circumstances. Devoting their days to studying the intricate hydraulics of the gun turrets, they had become experts in operating the steam turbines that would power the propellers at speeds close to 21 knots. Dreaming of the day they might bring this weapon home to Istanbul, they had spent their nights praying towards Mecca on the chilly decks of the English ship. In their letters home, they spoke with awe and delight about the wonderful ship. Rather than a mere piece of machinery, the Sultan Osman represented salvation to these individuals. A concrete guarantee that the national shame of yesteryear would never happen again. It was the materialization of their nation's aspirations. Back at home, they were aware that millions of people were anticipating their return. The fact that the Golden Horn bore flags was known to them. Istanbul's streets were crowded with youngsters practicing welcoming songs. As far as they were aware, the Sultan himself was getting ready to greet them with a ritual that would be legendary for years to come. Their departure was supposed to take place in precisely 5 days. Thousands of tons of coal from Wales filled the coal bunkers. Carefully examined and stored rounds filled the ammo magazines. In preparation for hoisting it over the stern as a symbol of national victory, the Turkish flag was folded. History is rarely a straight line. It is a series of calculated risks and hidden agendas. If you find these deep dives into the forces that shape our world valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. It helps us continue uncovering the untold stories of empires and economies. Now back to the narrative. What they didn't realize was that a decision was being made 300 miles south in a high-ceilinged office in Whitehall, London, that would destroy their aspirations and set the globe on fire. The First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, sat at his enormous mahogany desk and stared at a map of the North Sea. The placements of fleets and naval bases were marked on the map using pencil and pins. Churchill became the youngest man to ever occupy the position in modern times at the age of 39. He was a guy of boundless energy, intelligence, and haughtiness. He thought that boldness and determination could conquer any challenges. As the blue smoke from his huge cigar wafted over his desk, covered in stacks of urgent telegrams, he continued to work. The news that came via each telegraph was becoming worse. The news out of Europe was devastating. Sliding towards the abyss was the continent. A diplomatic avalanche was now forming, set in motion precisely 1 month ago by the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo. Serbia was under Austria-Hungary's thumb. In order to protect the Serbs, Russia had assembled its enormous steamroller army. Following the Schlieffen Plan, Germany, the continent's undisputed ruler, was getting ready to launch an attack on France via neutral Belgium. Nonetheless, the water occupied Churchill's thoughts. He was well aware that the Royal Navy would be crucial to Britain's survival in the event of war, which was increasingly a question of when rather than if. Most of the food that the island nation ate was imported. Britain will be hungry if its maritime channels were closed. The Grand Fleet's ability to subdue the German High Seas Fleet and maintain the blockade was crucial in preventing the economic collapse of Germany. He started mentally calculating. He tallied 22 big ships as British dreadnoughts. By his count, there were 15 major ships among the German dreadnoughts, and more were in the works. The lead was precariously narrow. In the early days of the war, the tide may turn in favor of the Germans if they were fortunate enough to have a few of British ships sink due to torpedo attacks or mines. It may only take Britain 1 day to lose the war. It all came down to one fleet action, the one that might make or break the empire and the planet. Every time he looked away, his gaze returned to the roster of foreign warships now being constructed in British yards. In addition, the names of 2 ships were staring back at him. It was the Rashadi and Sultan Osman Mird, the 2 most formidable warships of their time, the mega dreadnoughts, not to mention that they were Ottoman subjects whose allegiance was murky. A terrifying situation befell Churchill. Although the Ottoman Empire maintained its official neutrality, anybody with a grasp of regional geopolitics could see that German influence in Istanbul was steadily increasing. For a long time, the Germans had been trying to build contacts with the younger Turks. Officers from Germany were instructing the Ottoman army. Trains from Berlin to Baghdad were being constructed by German engineers. What if, after returning these ships to Turkey, the Turks quickly enlisted with the Germans? Imagine if the most elite British warships were used to attack and destroy other British ships in the Mediterranean, bombard British bases in Egypt, and endanger the empire's lifeblood, the Suez Canal. Churchill was unwilling to take that chance. A speech that would reverberate through history was made by him to the First Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg. We cannot afford to have these ships used against us. He didn't care about the legal ramifications. The ethical considerations took a back seat. In the grand scheme of empire, it didn't matter that the Ottoman government had already paid for the ships in full and sent every cent to British banks. They were to be stolen by Churchill. Peeling back the layers of history and looking at the collapsing Ottoman Empire will help us appreciate the overwhelming scale of this treachery. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia had coined the term the sick man of Europe decades before the empire became notorious throughout Europe in 1914. A funeral procession that had continued for 2 centuries, it was a tragedy of gradual breakdown. Russia, Britain, France, and Austria had been ripping pieces of the Ottoman map off like vultures preying on a cadaver for 2 centuries. Because to the revolt and British interference, Greece had been lost to them. Serbia was lost to nationalism. Due to Russian expansionism, they had lost Bulgaria. Egypt was formerly Ottoman until 1914, but they lost it to the British. In 1912, nevertheless, during the Balkan Wars, the last humiliation occurred. In what they said was a liberation war, a group of little Balkan states, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro attacked the empire, stealing territory. A catastrophe on a grand scale occurred. Due to a lack of resources and guidance, the Ottoman troops were decisively defeated. With tales of loss and slaughter, hundreds of thousands of refugees descended onto Istanbul. But the ocean delivered the worst blow. Although the Ottoman fleet was larger on paper, the Greek navy had only acquired 1 new armored cruiser, the Georgios Avarov, from Italy. For contemporary naval combat, the Avarov was a game-changer. It surpassed the Turks' arsenal in speed and weaponry. From a distance, it could bombard the Ottoman ships without taking damage itself. The Avar frightened the Ottoman fleet in 2 pivotal battles, The Battle of Ely and the Battle of Lemnosson, their own. It obstructed the Dinals, a little channel that linked the Aegean to the Marmara Sea, and beyond that, Istanbul. It prevented the Ottomans from resupplying their European provinces by sea, essentially shutting off their supply lines. No Ottoman ship dared to go out of the safety of the straits. The whole fleet was trapped. It was the pinnacle of national shame. From their perch on Istanbul's hills, the Turks saw their aging ironclads withdraw from a solitary Greek ship. The toll on people's mental health was enormous. Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, the new Young Turks cabinet, swore after the war that anything like would never happen again. This group aimed to bring the empire into the contemporary era. Its members were nationalists and modernizers. In today's geopolitical landscape, they came to understand dreadnoughts were the defining characteristic of sovereignty. Those with superior naval might were able to command the high seas, make their influence felt abroad, and command respect in international negotiations. Ships capable of crushing the Avar and whatever else the Greeks may obtain were necessary if they wanted to defend their coastline from Greek expansion, hang on to the islands in the Aegean, and avoid further humiliation. But there was no money in the Ottoman coffers. Decades of conflict and poor management had left the empire bankrupt. Ottoman Public Debt Administration was an international institution that collected taxes on behalf of foreign creditors. It was via this body that the European countries were able to regulate their finances. The most costly weaponry in the world would be out of reach for a bankrupt country. How come the yearly budget of a tiny province is equivalent to the cost of a single dreadnought? The Navy League was the correct response. A combination fundraising effort and religious revival was the goal of the government's newly announced campaign. They went straight for the heart of the people, appealing to their religious and nationalist feelings. For them, acquiring these warships became a sacred mission. There was more at play than only military tactics. Restoring Islam's dignity in Turkey was a central goal. Defending the religion against Christian forces who wanted to destroy the last major Muslim kingdom was how it was portrayed as a holy obligation. Across the empire, breathtaking and emotionally wrenching sights unfolded. Merchants in Istanbul's main marketplace, collecting boxes next to their shops, adorned with Ottoman flags and pictures of warships. Peasants in Anatolian villages who had never been to sea and who were struggling to provide for their family, trekked days to the next town to give a sack of grain or a sheep as a donation. The mosque imams proclaimed in their sermons that the Navy League's every lure was a volley in defense of the faithful, a nail in the ship's armor that would defend Muslim territories. In this effort, women were pivotal. Despite living in a conservative and conventional environment, where women were expected to stay at home and care for children, they achieved remarkable strides ahead. They planned bazaars to sell sweets and handmade goods for charity. They gave up their most prized items, including jewels. According to historical records, women would slip the gold bracelets, their only means of support in a patriarchal society, into the velvet bags owned by the Navy League. There were accounts of young women who donated the little they made from selling their long hair to wig manufacturers in Europe. Many elderly ladies donated their wedding bands. People of all backgrounds and socioeconomic statuses joined together in the national infatuation with the campaign and its sacrifice. To show appreciation, the government distributed ribbons and medals. A ribbon was given out to those who contributed even a little bit. The Donama Medagliasi, also known as the Navy Medal, is a bronze medal that may be awarded to those who made substantial donations. The affluent merchants and landowners were presented with medals made of silver and gold. Carrying these medals throughout town became a symbol of pride. People would treat you with mistrust if you entered a coffee shop without a Navy League ribbon on your lapel, as if you were a betrayer or a miser. The Ottoman people's immense patriotism was on full display in this massive mobilization of national riches. Because of the influx of gold into Istanbul, the authorities decided to go shopping. The political tensions and centuries-long animosity aside, Britain was still considered the pinnacle of naval engineering, so that's why they headed there. The world's most sophisticated warships were constructed in British shipyards. It was with the Barrow and Furness shipyard vicers that they first placed the Rashadia order. A contemporary battleship of robust construction, it was well designed and frightening. However, a distinctive chance presented itself later on. A massive ship for Brazil was being constructed at the Armstrong shipyard in Newcastle, named after the city of Rio de Janeiro. Along with other South American countries, Argentina and Chile, the Brazilians had instructed it to acquire dreadnoughts in order to win a naval arms race. However, as the rubber boom ended, Brazil's economy took a nosedive. British and Dutch farms in Southeast Asia sent the price of rubber crashing, which had made Brazil prosperous. The ship became unaffordable for the Brazilians. Armstrong Whitworth suffered a huge financial setback as it sat on the stock's half-finish, seeking a buyer. Like a hawk seeing prey, the Ottoman authorities swooped in. Their target was the Navy League funds. French financiers were keen to keep the Ottoman relationship alive, so they loaned them money at hefty interest rates. They rechristened the Rio de Janeiro after the first Sultan Osman, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, after purchasing it. Sultan Osman's criteria were strange and scary. Regardless of the practical repercussions, the Brazilians desired the highest amount of weaponry in order to dazzle the world and scare their neighbors. 8 or 10 heavy guns were standard on most battleships. With 14 of them, Sultan Osman had an unmatched arsenal. It was a glass cannon, not as well armored as ships from the British or the Germans, but with enough power to destroy everything in the water. A wager that firepower might triumph over defense, the ship was an adventurous risk. Now we're back in July of 1914. The warships were purchased. There was a last transfer of gold to the Bank of England. In all legal and technical respects, Sultan Osman and the Rashadia were fully sovereign Ottoman territories, much like the Istanbul Palace. The mood, however, was shifting in Newcastle. The leader of the Ottoman expedition, Captain Rauf Bey, started to feel something was different. In the Balkan Wars, the heroic naval commander Rauf Bey launched daring attacks, slipping tiny torpedo boats past enemy patrols. He was a national hero. As the flagship's captain, he was an ideal pick. After becoming friendly with the British engineers, he even learned their language and started eating with them. However, during the last week of July, the British managers began to avoid making eye contact with him. Discussions loosened their grip. No one was notified when meetings were rescheduled. On the 29th of July, Churchill issued a covert directive, bureaucratic red tape at its finest. Without being overt about it, he instructed the shipbuilders to postpone the departure. Try to be understated. Inventing technological difficulties was his instruction. Suppose it was necessary to test the hydraulic pumps. Suppose the hoists for the ammo were sticky. Imagine if the coal bunkers need restacking in order to distribute their weight evenly. Keep those ships from leaving, no matter what you do. Bey, however, was not naive. Frustrated by the lack of response, he continued to visit the shipyard every day. He caught sight of the ship. It buzzed with activity. As the boilers were ignited, smoke billowed out of the funnels. Crates of food and barrels of fresh water were among the supplies he saw being loaded. However, the British foreman barred his route with courteous reasons and remorseful shrugs when he attempted to go up the gangway. Encrypted telegrams were dispatched to Istanbul by Rauf Bey in a panic. The Brits are playing chicken. I am afraid they plan to take the ships hostage. Before it was too late, he asked for permission to board forcibly if needed and escape the port. However, the Istanbul administration advised him to be patient since they were too busy worrying about the developing crisis in Europe to do anything to provoke Britain. They had faith that the British would come out on top. They were astounded that the Magna Carta nation, which took such pleasure in its adherence to the rule of law, would perpetrate such an egregious crime of theft. August 1st, 1914, was the morning when the whole show came to a halt. Word got out to Churchill that Germany was about to declare war on Russia. Continental powers were getting ready to move. A conflict broke out between Britain and its enemies within days. His patience had run out. The requisition order was issued by him. Along Newcastle's cobblestone streets, a British infantry unit from the Sherwood Foresters Regiment marched. With bayonets at the ready and rifles draped over their shoulders, they were dressed like warriors. As the troops advanced through the shipyard's gates and positioned themselves around the dry dock, the locals observed in bewilderment. They prepared to assassinate any resistance by positioning the tripod-mounted Maxim machine guns to fire on the Sultan Osman's gangways. When Captain Rauf Bey got to the pier, bayonets were already around his ship. He was contacted by a senior British commander who was stern and professional. On official government stationery, he presented a letter to Rauf Bey. The document said that the government of His Majesty was using its preemptive requisition power because of a national emergency. The Ottoman workers were given the urgent order to gather their possessions and depart from the region. No wiggle room would be allowed. An atmosphere of utter shame pervaded the scene. After learning the names of the British workers and sharing smokes with them, the Turkish sailors who had been polishing the brass and cleaning the decks observed as the Royal Navy sailors in blue jackets marched onto the ship and assumed command of their respective stations. Ralph Bay had prepared the captain's stateroom, and they saw British officers enter it. Deliberately, the Crimson Crescent and Star, together with the Ottoman flag, were lowered from the stern. Standing tall and swaying in the breeze was the white ensign of the Royal Navy. Standing on the pier, Ralph Bay tightened his hands and fought back tears of anger. A guy taught to conceal emotion, he was a warrior. However, he experienced the gravity of a national catastrophe at the same time. For him, this was a sign. Shipwrecks weren't the only thing that happened. As a whole, the Ottoman Empire took a beating. It was a signal from the British capital that the Turks were beneath them, that British interests took precedence over their honor and property. Then he rounded up his crew. They got on the ship that would return them to Istanbul, their expressions a mix of grief and rage. It was a funeral procession on the way home. Going back, they had no valuables to offer. Millions of people had pledged their gold, and they had to confront them. It was their responsibility to inform the students that the hair they had sold had been for nothing. Their wedding bands had purchased treachery, which they had to explain to the elderly ladies. The response in Istanbul was eruptive as soon as the news reached the city. The depth of the rage is difficult for us living in a different environment now to comprehend. This was about more than simply governments at odds with one another. The heist was an intimate one. Churchill felt as if he had plucked every man's pocket that had a Navy League medal on it. The publication published headlines that demanded retribution and cried out for bloodshed. As a sign of grief, people tore down or hung black crepe over the Navy League posters that had shown the ship sailing to glory. There was chaos in the Ottoman government in the Dolmabahce Palace. The administration was fractured. Halim Pasha, according to the Grand Vizier, was an impartial moderate. He said that the empire was too feeble to engage in combat, and that doing so would be a tragic mistake. At the very least, he intended to recover the funds by negotiating reparations with Britain. However, Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, was a very different kind of guy. Enver was a 32-year-old German patriot who was ambitious, cruel, and much in love with his country. The Germans' efficiency and military might had astonished him during his time as a military attaché in Berlin. Fluent in German, he sported a mustache that was distinctly German. In his view, Britain was a waning empire that clung to antiquated ideas of supremacy, while Germany represented the future. The idea of an alliance with Germany has been on Enver's radar for months. The other ministers, however, had been reluctant. They were wary of British reprisal and revered Britain's naval might. However, Enver now had the ideal Tula rallying cry thanks to Churchill. During the cabinet meeting, Enver sprang to his feet and pounded the table with his fist. "Take a look at what the Brits have accomplished," he said. "They treat us like slaves. They steal our ships. They spit on our honor. How can we trust them? The Germans treat us like warriors. They offer us an alliance of equals." And indeed, the Germans were quick to capitalize on the crisis. The Kaiser in Berlin instantly saw the possibility. The wrath of the Ottomans was obvious to him. In the absence of their fleet, he was aware that they felt helpless. The solution to their naval dilemma, he reasoned, would win them over and pave the way for a new front against Russia. Under the leadership of Admiral Wilhelm Sohn, Germany maintained a naval squadron in the Mediterranean. It was comprised of the light cruiser Breslau and the battle cruiser Goeben. While the Sultan Osman had superior strength, the Goeben was a more agile and battle-hardened vessel. Its reputation for ferocity and speed was based on its experience in the Adriatic. A clandestine radio communication was sent to Admiral Souchon by the German High Command on August 3rd. As hostilities broke out across Europe due to the invasion of Belgium by Germany and the ultimatums issued by Britain. The next stop is Constantinople. The most spectacular naval pursuit in maritime history began with this command. After recently bombarding French ports, Souchon found herself in the western Mediterranean, close to Algeria. He had to cruise east for over 1,000 miles, smack dab in the middle of British naval supremacy, to reach Istanbul. Admiral Archibald Berkeley Milner, a cautious commander who had ridden his connections rather than his intellect to the top of the British Mediterranean force, was leading the pursuit of him. Milner had an enormous energy. There were a total of 12 cruisers, 3 warships, 4 armored, and 4 light. He had 10 times more men than Suchan. A simple murder ought to have been possible. The British ships have superior speed and armament. It ought to have taken no more than a few hours. Suchan, on the other hand, was a sailor of tremendous talent and resolve, and he had an advantage as desperation. Unable to return home, he knew it. It was the British who had control of the Gibraltar Strait. He was unable to cross the Atlantic. With the Dardanelles, he had no other choice. His ships were instructed to go at maximum speed by him. Problems with boiler tube failures plagued the Goeben's engines. I didn't like the coal, cheap, inefficient material that generated more smoke than heat. However, Susan was a persistent driver for his guys. Temperatures within the boiler rooms reached well above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Due to heat stroke and weariness, the stovers passed out. Not to kill the enemy, but to make sure the soldiers continued shoveling coal into the furnaces, German officials stood with their guns drawn. Both time and gasoline were competing factors. The British made a number of mistakes during the pursuit that would stay with Mill forever. The Admiral exercised caution. The safety of the French troop transporters traveling from Africa to France was a major concern of his. Churchill in London gave him commands that were difficult to understand. When the time was right to strike, he hesitated. Through the net, Suchan slid. He battled British light cruisers in a running engagement, but his massive artillery held them off. On fumes, he made it to the INC. There was hardly any coal in his bunkers. He disregarded the neutrality restrictions that forced him to make a port call at a Greek island in order to purchase coal from a commercial ship. First and foremost, we had to stay alive. The Goeben and the Breslau reached the mouth of the Dardanelles in the afternoon of August 10, 1914. Huge Ottoman forts lined the approach to the straits, their powerful cannons and naval mines obstructing the passage. His ships were halted by Suchan. At the fort, he spoke with the Turkish commander via radio. "It is my sincere desire to get admitted." The future of the Middle East was hanging in the balance at this very moment. The dispatch reached Ver Pasha when he was serving at the Defense Ministry. "German warships have arrived in the harbor. They are being pursued by the British Navy. Allowing them entry would be a breach of neutrality on our part. We can prevent the British from sinking them by keeping them out." Hesitantly, the Grand Vizier waited. Although it was not formally proclaimed, he was aware that allowing them to enter constituted an act of war against Britain. Contrary to popular belief, Enver Pasha moved quickly. He grabbed the opportunity and acted independently. The forts received his message. Set the mines in motion. Soak them in. On the horizon, the British vanguard emerged as the boom nets split and the gray forms of the German vessels slid into the Placid Straits. Only a few hours separated them. Slam! The door was shut. A diplomatic crisis, however, has just arisen. Sir Louis Mallet, the British ambassador in Istanbul, barged into the office of the Grand Vizier. He made it clear that he wanted the German ships redirected. Any hostile vessel that approaches a neutral nation's ports is subject to international law, which mandates the arrest of the crew and the disarmament of their weaponry. They had the Ottomans ensnared. Enver would not permit their arrest of the Germans. They were hesitant to acknowledge they were protecting them for fear of a war declaration. And then someone, maybe a Turkish minister or a German diplomat, had an epiphany and told a falsehood so audacious that it altered the course of events. An official statement was issued by the Ottoman administration. They said, "We have not sheltered these ships. We have bought them. The German government has kindly agreed to sell us the Goeben and the Breslau to replace the 2 ships that the British stole from us." It was pure theater. No money changed hands. The ships were still German property in every legal sense. But the propaganda value was immense. The Turkish people, who had been in mourning for their lost ships, suddenly went wild with joy. The British stole our ships, so the Germans gave us new ones? It was poetic justice, a reversal of fortune. On August 16th, a ceremony was held in the Golden Horn that was surreal even by the standards of the war. The German naval inn was lowered from the stern of the Goeben. The Ottoman flag with the crescent and star was raised. The ship was renamed the Yavuz Sultan Selim after one of the most feared Ottoman sultans. The Breslau was renamed the Medidili. But there was a problem. The Ottomans didn't have any sailors trained to operate these complex German turbines and fire control systems. So the German crews didn't leave. Instead, crates of uniforms were brought on board. The German sailors, blonde-haired, blue-eyed men from Hamburg and Kiel, took off their marine uniforms and put on Ottoman uniforms. They put on fezzes. Admiral Suchan, the German aristocrat, put on a fez and was appointed commander-in-chief of the Ottoman Navy. The British ambassador watched this masquerade with fury. He knew they were still German ships. He knew the orders were still coming from Berlin. But the diplomatic fiction held. Britain was not yet ready to fight the Turks, not while the battle was still raging on the Western Front. For 2 months, the Yavuz sat in the harbor, a loaded gun pointed at the heart of Russia, the peace held by a thread. The moderate ministers in the Ottoman government tried desperately to keep the empire neutral. They argued that they had their ships now, so they could stay out of the war. But Enver Pasha and Admiral Suchan had other plans. They had secret orders from the Kaiser: bring Turkey into the war, open a new front to distract the Russians and the British. Suchan grew impatient. He was tired of sitting at anchor. He was a warrior, not a diplomat. He wanted to fight. In late October, he went to Enver. They hatched a plot to force the government's hand to create a crisis that would make neutrality impossible. On October 27th, Admiral Suchan took his fleet, the Avis, the Medili, and a squadron of Turkish destroyers into the Black Sea. He announced he was going on a training maneuver, a routine exercise. He steamed north into the cold gray waters toward the Russian coast. He ordered radio silence to be broken only by battle commands. On the morning of October 29, 1914, the citizens of the Russian port of Sevastopol woke up to a thunderous roar that shook windows and rattled dishes. They looked out to sea and saw a massive battleship flying the Turkish flag, firing heavy shells into the harbor. The Yavuz pounded the Russian naval base. Shells crashed into warehouses, docks, and ships. Simultaneously, the Medili shelled the port of Novorossiysk, sinking 14 transport ships and setting the massive oil storage tanks on fire. The smoke from the burning oil turned the day into night, a black cloud that could be seen for 50 miles. It was a sneak attack, a Pearl Harbor of the Black Sea. Suchan had done it. He had committed an act of war so flagrant, so brutal, that there was no going back. When the news reached Istanbul, the moderate ministers were horrified. They tried to draft an apology to the Czar. They tried to claim that Suchan had gone rogue, acting without orders. But the Russians were not interested in apologies. They had been attacked by Turkish ships flying Turkish flags. On November the 2nd, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. On November 5th, Britain and France declared war. The sick man of Europe had thrown away his crutches and picked up a gun. The Middle East was at war, and it all started because Winston Churchill wanted to save 2 ships. The Black Sea raid was the point of no return. As the Russian oil tanks burned in Novorossiysk, the fires of war began to consume the Middle East. In London, Winston Churchill received the news with a grim determination. His nightmare had come true. The Ottoman Empire had joined the Central Powers. The Dinals were closed, cutting off the vital supply line to Russia. The Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the British Empire, was now within striking distance of the Turkish armies. Churchill, the man who prided himself on his strategic vision, felt the weight of his own decision pressing down on him. He had stolen the Sultan Osman to protect the Royal Navy, but in doing so, he had handed the enemy a strategic victory far greater than the value of 2 battleships. He needed to fix it. He needed a knockout blow that would vindicate his decision. His eyes turned to the map of the Dinals, that narrow winding strait that separated Europe from Asia and led directly to Istanbul. Churchill conceived a plan that was audacious, daring, and ultimately doomed. He believed that the Royal Navy was invincible. He believed that if he sent a massive fleet of battleships to force the straits, they could blast the Ottoman forts into dust, sail up to the Golden Horn, and aim their guns at the Sultan's palace. The Ottoman government, he believed, would panic and surrender. The sick man would die of fright. It was a plan born of arrogance. It ignored the lessons of history. It ignored the fact that ships fighting forts almost always lose. Forts have stable gun platforms. They can't sink. But Churchill was convinced. In February 1915, a colossal armada gathered in the ANC. It included the most powerful ships in the British and French navies. And in a twist of irony that would make a Greek tragedian weep, one of the ships in the fleet was the HMS Agincourt. The Agincourt was the renamed Sultan Osman Furnish, the very ship that had been stolen. It was now sailing to attack the people who had paid for it. The Turkish gunners in the forts, looking through their binoculars, would have recognized its silhouette. They knew the number of its guns. They knew the shape of its turrets. Seeing their own stolen property bearing down on them, flying the enemy flag filled them with a cold, resolute fury. They were not just defending their capital. They were fighting a personal vendetta. The naval attack began on February 19th. The British ships unleashed a storm of steel. The noise was deafening, a continuous rolling thunder that could be heard in Istanbul, 40 miles away. The Agincourt, with its 141 12-inch guns, fired full broadsides that shook the sea itself. The Ottoman forts crumbled under the impact. Stone walls built centuries ago disintegrated. But the Ottomans had a secret weapon. It was not a battleship. It was a small, insignificant mine layer named the Nusret. While the British Armada was pounding the outer forts, the Nusret had slipped out silently at night. Its captain, a young officer with keen tactical instincts, had noticed a pattern. The British ships would steam up the straits, fire their guns, and then turn starboard into Araronkoy Bay to retreat and let the next wave of ships come in. The Nusret laid a line of 26 naval mines, not across the channel as was standard, but parallel to the shore, right in the maneuvering area of the British fleet. On March 18, 1915, the British launched their main attack. 18 battleships steamed into the straits in 3 waves. They silenced the forts. Admiral Drobeck, the British commander, thought he had won. Victory seemed within reach. Now he ordered the French squadron to turn back and the British reserve squadron to move forward. The French battleship Bouvet turned into Araronkoy Bay. At 1:54 p.m., a massive explosion ripped the ocean apart. A column of water and flame shot hundreds of feet into the air. The Bouvet had struck one of the Nusret's mines. The ship broke in half. In less than 2 minutes, it capsized and vanished beneath the waves, taking 600 French sailors with it. The British thought it was a torpedo or a lucky shell from the forts. They didn't realize they were drifting into a minefield. Minutes later, the British battleship HMS Irresistible struck a mine. A huge hole was blown in its hull. Then HMS Ocean struck a mine. The battlecruiser HMS Inflexible struck a mine and began to list heavily, water pouring into its compartments. Panic seized the fleet. In a single afternoon, the Allies had lost 3 capital ships and had 3 more crippled. A third of the fleet was out of action. The mighty Royal Navy, which had ruled the waves for a century, had been defeated by a tiny mine layer and the hubris of its commanders. Churchill was devastated. The naval attack was called off, but the Allies could not walk away. Too much prestige was at stake. They decided that if ships couldn't do it, soldiers would have to. This led to the land invasion of Gallipoli. On April 25, 1915, Allied troops, British, Australian, New Zealand, French, and Indian, stormed the beaches. They expected a march to Istanbul in a week. Instead, they found themselves pinned down on narrow strips of sand and rock, exposed to murderous fire from the heights above. The Ottoman soldiers, led by Mustafa Kemal, fought with the desperation of men defending their last home. They held the high ground. For 8 months, the campaign became a meat grinder. It was trench warfare in the heat of the Mediterranean summer. Dysentery and flies killed as many men as bullets. Bodies rotted in no man's land. By the time the Allies evacuated in defeat in January 1916, over 500,000 men were dead or wounded. The beaches were graveyards. The dream of a quick victory had turned into a nightmare. Winston Churchill was the political casualty. He was forced to resign as First Lord of the Admiral. He was scapegoat for the disaster. He left London in disgrace and went to serve as a battalion commander in the trenches of the Western Front, trying to wash away the stain of Gallipoli in the mud of Flanders. The ghost of the stolen ships haunted him for years, but the war continued. The Sultan Osman, now the Agincourt, survived the Dardanelles. It was sent north to join the Grand Fleet at Scapa in the Orkney Islands. On May 31, 1916, the Agincourt sailed out to meet the German High Seas Fleet at the Battle of Jutland, the largest naval clash in history. Over 200 ships engaged in a massive fleet action in the cold waters of the North Sea. The Aginort was a strange beast in the British line. The British sailors called it the Gin Palace because its fittings were luxurious, meant for Ottoman officers. The captain's quarters had ornate woodwork, but in battle it was a monster. During the night action at Jutland, the Agent Court found itself close to the German battle line. The captain gave the order to open fire. The Agent Court did something that no other ship had ever done. It fired all 14 of its 12-in guns at once, a full broadside. The flash was so bright that observers on other ships thought the Agent Court had blown up. The recoil was so violent that it shattered the crockery in the galley and stripped the paint off the deck. But the ship held together. It hurled 7 tons of steel at the Germans in seconds. It was a terrifying display of the power that the Ottomans had sought to possess. But tactical victories at sea could not save the Ottoman Empire on land. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The war dragged on for 4 brutal years. The British blockade starved the Ottoman cities. Food became scarce. Inflation soared. The Arab revolt, fueled by British gold and promises of independence, tore away the southern provinces. To Lawrence, the famed Lawrence of Arabia, rallied Arab tribes against Ottoman rule. Jerusalem fell to General Allenby in December 1917. Baghdad fell. Damascus fell. The empire was collapsing from within and without. By 1918, the Ottoman armies were exhausted. The empire was bankrupt. On October 30th, 1918, aboard the British battleship HMS Agamemnon, anchored off the island of Lemnos, the Ottoman delegation signed the Armistice of Mudros. It was an unconditional surrender. 13 days later, on November the 13th, 1918, the final scene of this tragedy played out. An Allied fleet of 60 ships sailed through the Dennels. The minefields had been swept. The forts were silent. Their guns spiked and abandoned. They steamed past the graves of the men who had died at Gallipoli. They entered the Sea of Marmara and dropped anchor in the Golden Horn directly in front of the Dolmabahce Palace in the Hagia Sophia. It was the first time since 1453, since the fall of Constantinople to Mehmed the Conqueror, that a foreign fleet had occupied Constantinople. And there in the middle of the fleet flying, the Union Jack, was the HMS Aginort. The ship had finally come home, but it had come as an executioner. For the people of Istanbul watching from the hills, the sight was heartbreaking. They remembered the gold bracelets. They remembered the children's hair. They saw their own ship, the vessel that was supposed to save them, now acting as the flagship of the occupation. It was a symbol of total defeat. The aftermath of the war reshaped the world map. The Treaty of Sarah partitioned the Ottoman Empire like a carcass. The British and French diplomats Mark Sykes and François Gorpico had already drawn lines on the map, carving up the Middle East into zones of influence with barely a thought for the people who lived there. Britain took Iraq and Palestine. France took Syria and Lebanon. The borders were drawn with a ruler, paying no attention to the ethnic or religious realities on the ground. The Kurds were left without a state, divided among Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. The Arabs, who had been promised independence by Britain in exchange for their revolt, were given colonial mandates instead. The seeds of every major conflict in the modern Middle East, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the rise of ISIS, were sown in the wreckage of the Ottoman collapse. And what of the ships themselves? The HMS Aen Court, despite its impressive performance at Jutland, was never loved by the Royal Navy. It was considered a structural freak. It was too long, too difficult to maneuver. After the war in 1921, the British government decided to scrap it. The ship that had caused a world war, the ship that had cost millions in gold and blood, was towed to a breaker's yard in Scotland. It was cut apart by acetylene torches. Its mighty guns were melted down. Its steel was recycled into razor blades, cars, and bridges. The Rashadi, renamed HMS Erin, suffered the same fate. Scrapped in 1921, 2 super-dreadnoughts reduced to scrap metal. But the Goeben, the German ship that had started the war, survived. Renamed the Yavuz, it became the flagship of the new Turkish Navy. It served the new Turkish Republic, founded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the hero of Gallipoli, who transformed Turkey into a modern nation. When Ataturk died in 1938, his body was carried on the deck of the Yavuz in a final salute. It remained in service until the 1950s. The last surviving battlecruiser of the Great War, It was finally scrapped in 1973, a lingering ghost of the imperial age. As we look back at this story a century later, the question remains, was it worth it? Winston Churchill believed he did the right thing. He secured the naval balance in the North Sea. He ensured that the Royal Navy had the margin of victory. From a purely British naval perspective, the seizure was a success. The agent court fought at Jutland and contributed to British naval supremacy. But the geopolitical cost was incalculable. If Churchill had allowed the ships to sail, the Ottoman Empire might have remained neutral. The pro-B British faction in the government would have been strengthened. The Danelles would have remained open, allowing supplies to reach Russia. Russia might have been stronger, better equipped to withstand the German offensives. Without the Ottoman entry into the war, the entire character of the conflict would have changed. The war would have been shorter, millions of lives might have been saved. The Russian Revolution might have been averted or delayed, changing the entire course of the 20th century. The map of the Middle East would look completely different today. There might have been no Iraq, no Syria, no Palestine mandate, and therefore no Israeli-Palestinian conflict as we know it. The theft of the Sultan Osman was a tactical victory, but a strategic catastrophe. It demonstrated the blindness of imperial power. Churchill saw battleships as just machines, tools of war. He didn't see them as symbols. He didn't understand that by stealing a nation's pride, he was creating an enemy far more dangerous than any fleet. The legacy of that theft is written in the history books, but it is also written in the memory of the region. It reinforced a narrative of betrayal that persists to this day. The idea that the West speaks of law and justice, but practices piracy when it suits its interests. This narrative has shaped Middle Eastern attitudes toward the West for generations. The day Winston Churchill stole the Ottoman Navy, he thought he was just seizing two holes of steel. In reality, he was seizing the destiny of the Middle East and steering it toward a century of storm. The shipyards of Newcastle are quiet now. The great dreadnoughts are gone, reduced to memories and museum pieces. But the echoes of the guns of the Sultan Osman are still ringing in the world we live in today. Every conflict, every border dispute, every act of terrorism in the Middle East can trace its roots back in part to the decisions made in that gray morning in 1914 when a British politician decided that power mattered more than honor.